Good evening and welcome to Q&A and to Science Week. I'm Tony Jones. Joining us tonight, the first Indigenous woman to be elected to the House of Representatives, Shadow Minister for Human Services, Linda Burney. Particle physicist and broadcaster Brian Cox, whose latest documentary series unravels the fundamental forces of nature. Mathematician Lily Serna, who unlocks the puzzles on letters and numbers. The Minister for Industry, Innovation and Science, Greg Hunt. And One Nation Senator-elect Malcolm Roberts, who wants a royal commission into climate science. Please welcome our panel. Well, Q&A is live in the eastern states on ABC TV and in the centre and west on News 24. You can also watch and listen live across Australia on iView and News Radio and around the world on Facebook. Let's go to our first question. It's from Naomi Cooper.
The Nauru files are the largest set of leaked documents published from inside Australia's immigration detention system. They set out more than 2,000 first-hand incident reports written by guards, caseworkers and teachers on the remote Pacific Island, including self-harm, sexual assaults, child abuse, hunger strikes, assaults and injuries. Good government policy is evidence-based. What further evidence, besides the Australian Human Rights Commission's The Forgotten Children Report, the Moss Report, and now these new documents, will it take for the government to change its callous and cruel offshore detention centre policies?
Greg Hunt, we'll start with you.
Look, I appreciate the points, and I think it is very important that any possible abuse, any possible mistreatment is investigated not just lightly, but fully, completely and absolutely. The context for all of this, of course, is that there was a terrible moment in Australian history where over a period of years 1,200 lives were lost at sea, 1,200 beautiful souls lost. And so action had to be taken, of course, started by the previous government and continued by us. The loss of lives at sea has stopped, which I think is something we should be deeply thankful for. And now, if there is evidence, it's our duty, our task, our responsibility to make sure it's completely and absolutely investigated. OK,
well, the evidence includes 2,116 incidents. More than 1,000 of them involve children. That's 7 reports of children being sexually assaulted, 59 reports of other assaults, 30 of children self-harming and so on. Why call a royal commission into abuse of children in the Northern Territory but not on Nauru?
Well, I think the first thing is that it was the right decision in relation to the Northern Territory. And this, of course, comes against a long history going back to the Little Children Are Sacred report and then what we saw most recently coming out of the Dondale Detention Centre. That was the right decision. What we have here is an ongoing case of investigation. Each and every one of the claims can, will, and in some cases already has been investigated. And the context, I think, of remembering that everything that's occurred was to stop just the horrendous, inexplicable and indefensible loss of life at sea.
OK,
so,
that was a point you made earlier and we didn't interrupt you. Very briefly, do you support the Senate inquiry? You're obviously not going to support a royal commission.
Look, I haven't had discussions with my colleagues on that. The principle...
Do you have an opinion?
The principle that I lay down and we lay down is that each and every claim can, will and must be investigated fully and absolutely.
OK, Linda Burney.
Look, I think it needs to go much further than that, and hello everyone, it's wonderful to be here. The report that we're talking about, the 2,000 incidences, as I understand it, is an incident report that goes to the government. These reports have been delivered since 2011, so the fundamental question is how long has it been known that these things were taking place on Nauru, and why is it that an Australian journalist or a politician cannot get on a plane and go to Nauru and have a look themselves? I believe that there is every reason we should have at least a Senate inquiry into what's going on in Nauru.
Would you go further than a Senate inquiry? The Greens want a royal commission.
The position of my party, Labor, is a Senate inquiry at this point in time. There was also, everyone, an invitation from Bill Shorten to the Prime Minister to go together to Nauru, and I understand that that has not been accepted. What needs to happen in terms of Nauru is an openness and an accountability that simply does not exist now.
Just very briefly on this, and we'll go on to the other panellists,
Sure.
but do you and does Labor accept collective responsibility for what happened there since you set it up?
I mean, the Minister has made the point that the Labor government had some role in establishing Nauru. That's true. But let me be very clear, everyone.
Some role, you established it.
Well, that's true. But let me be very clear on this, is that what we're saying very, very much now is that there has to be openness. We're calling for a children's commissioner, a type of ombudsman, as well as the capacity for people to go to Nauru to actually see what's going on. That does not exist. And the question fundamentally here is, what has the government known and for how long has it known about such incidences?
Let's go to Malcolm Roberts at the end. New Senator, you'll be there, however, in time to consider whether or not to support a Senate inquiry. Will One Nation senators support a Senate inquiry?
I am new to the business. My actual role is as a public servant to the people of Queensland and Australia. So I'm also a human, and I feel for these people as refugees. But I think, Tony, we need to look at the evidence, and I don't know the formal procedures in the Senate yet, but I've read articles saying that there's a lot of questions that need to be asked about the evidence. I just wonder whether or not we're being given the correct evidence.
Well, Labor wants a Senate inquiry. The Greens will give them some of the numbers to do that. What will be required is for some of the crossbench senators, 5 I think, to support it. Will you support it?
I don't know, because I need to look at the
You've got an open mind,
look at the evidence. That's correct. We need to do what's right for the country and what's in the national interest. As I said, I think there's been a lot of exaggeration around this, reading some articles, and I question the figures, but on limited evidence.
When you say exaggeration, what do you mean?
I've talked to Pauline about this, and she has consulted with someone who used to be employed as a guard or a
and the guard suggested that there are exaggerations?
Yes. And Chris Kenny, who I happen to have quite a bit of regard for. I don't know if he's well regarded within the ABC, but I have a lot of regard for Chris Kenny, and he made the point that there is a lot of exaggeration and the situation is not being led to us properly.
But surely part of the appalling discussion here is it's almost as if humanity doesn't exist. And the very fact that the government responsible minister actually questioned whether or not people were self-harming for reasons other than being desperate, and questioned whether or not the report and the incidences were true. I mean, as if people are going to go out and get themselves assaulted, children are going to go out and get themselves abused, and that should not be questioned by the minister. I think that was disgusting.
All right, let's hear from the other panellists. Liddy, you've asked a couple of questions there. Let's hear what you think.
Well, I'm with you, Linda. I think above all else, we've got to remember, no matter what your political persuasion is, that these are people who have been through an incredibly traumatic experience. And not only are we putting them into indefinite detention, they're going through unspeakable abuse. And this is what we have to remember. These are humans. These are mums and dads and kids and their families. It's I think that in the political process, everyone seems to forget that.
Well, I agree with you, but there is some evidence that quite a bit of that abuse is occurring from the families themselves. So we can't just blame the caretakers. But if there is a problem with the caretakers, then that needs to be addressed as a separate thing. But we need to find out where the abuse is coming from.
And
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, we need to find out, and I think there's a lot of secrecy that's going on. There are no third-party people allowed to go there. Reporters aren't allowed to go there. How are we supposed to find out if there are no reports?
I was going to interrupt you there to hear from Brian, because I'd just like to get your perspective as an outsider. How does this look to you?
Well, I know very little about this particular story, but I would say that these problems are problems across the world. I mean, in Europe, we have a big problem with refugees moving out of Syria, moving out of those conflict zones. And they are problems that I think require global international solutions. I think what we're seeing everywhere, we've seen it in Britain as well, is that the nation states alone have difficulties dealing with problems such as this. And so that you've seen the tension in Europe. Britain voted to leave Europe partly on immigration issues and on so I think that the solutions are, I mean, you could broaden the more philosophical about it. I wonder, we're going to talk about other, we'll probably talk about climate, I suspect, later. These are global problems require global solutions. And I don't think, actually, that our institutions and based on nation states are capable of dealing with these 21st century problems. And you see it with refugee problems.
OK, let's move on, because there are a lot of questions in the audience. Brian, you've anticipated pretty much the next one. It's from Susie Wakefield.
Hello. Recently on Insiders, Malcolm Roberts gave Barry Cassidy his business card and asked Barry to get back to him when he had proof and data that there is a human element in our increasing climate change. I was hoping the panel could perhaps guide Barry with some fact and just not opinion on the human element in climate change.
I was going to start with Brian Cox, the scientist on the panel, and can you provide scientific data or evidence that might help Barry Cassidy convince Malcolm over here that human-induced climate change is a reality?
Well, yes, and I could sit here and read out figures until I'm blue in the face. I mean, interestingly, it's getting more worrying if you look at the temperature measurements now. I mean, 2015 and 2016 in particular have seen a quite shocking acceleration in many of the measures, be it surface temperatures, ocean temperatures, etc. So the first few months I noticed of 2016 have above the average, the pre-industrial average, have been pushing 1.5 degrees. Now, you can't read too much into individual years. You have to be careful because you see these graphs and they're spiky, but there's a clear rise. And
well, the latest data is actually suggesting that by 2024, 1.5 degree increase is on the cards now, which puts us very close to the critical 2%.
And that's a prediction of the models. But actually, in the early months of 2016 have already shown that. So we don't know how 2016 is going to continue. But that is a worrying problem.
Because what would happen if we reach 2%?
Oh, there are some shocking predictions, actually, that you see where places in the Middle East, for example, that are already experiencing temperatures sometimes in excess of 50 degrees, I think, this year, become essentially uninhabitable for certain periods of time. So it exacerbates, sea level rise, etc. What it does, it exacerbates some of the problems we're seeing. We just spoke about refugee problems. If you begin to get large shifts in climate very fast, then human populations have to respond. So how do you respond on very short timescales? One of the things you do is you move. So again, I emphasise it's the same answer as the answer to the last question, I think. This is now a clear global problem. The absolute consensus is that human action is leading to an increase in average temperatures. Absolute consensus. I know you may try to argue with that, but you can't.
No, not in my
But therefore, but the key point is, can we respond to it? Do we have the political institutions and the political will and the organisation globally to respond to this challenge? And that worries me immensely. I don't think we do at the moment.
I'm going to go quickly to Malcolm Roberts. We want to hear from all the panellists on this.
Sure. The longest temperature record for temperatures on this planet is the Central England temperature record, which goes back to the mid-1600s. And the latest in the 17th century, the latest warming cycle in the 17th century going into the 18th century was faster and greater than the latest warming, which finished in 1995. And Justin Bieber wasn't flying his private jet around in the 1600s. That's the first thing. The second thing was we've had a pause in this so-called warming for now 21 years. Depends how you measure it, 21 years. And I'm absolutely stunned that someone who is inspired by Richard Feynman, a fantastic scientist who believes in empirical evidence, is quoting a consensus.
Can I just say, I brought the graph, right? I mean, can I just...
Okay,
I'll just tell you where the pause is. The pause that's often quoted. There's if you take this point here, which is about 1997, I think, and you ignore 2015, 2016, you can choose that point and you can draw a slightly straighter trend line on there. But that's a misunderstanding. The question is, does that rise? And also, secondly, I brought another graph because I thought, is it correlated with that, which is the graph that shows the CO2 emissions, the CO2 in parts per million in the atmosphere. And you see that peak there, where it goes flying up. So the question essentially is, first of all, are those two things correlated? And secondly, do we understand the physical mechanisms? And we understood those since the 19th century.
Brian,
I mean, I can teach you. I'll give you a lesson if you want. I can give you.
Can you go back to the middle of the graph there?
Yeah. That graph.
Yeah, the peak in the middle.
Yep.
What year is that?
That's about 1941.
Yeah, 1930s and 40s were warmer than the current decades. Where's that?
Well, no,
what's the data source?
Well, not exactly.
No, the original records are.
I don't know that we should argue about
The original records are far warmer. But the other thing that tells me that graph has got something wrong with it is that 1998 was about the same as 2015-16.
Okay, I'm just going to pause here. So you're hearing.
It was an El Nino year.
Both were El Nino years.
Malcolm, just 1 second. You're hearing the interpretation of a highly qualified scientist, and you're just saying, "I don't believe it." Is that right?
I'm saying two things. I'm saying two things. First of all, that the data has been corrupted, and we know that the 1930s were warmer than today.
Yeah. Corrupted? What do you mean corrupted?
Been manipulated
by who?
By NASA.
NASA?
Yes.
The people. Hang on a minute. No, so this is quite serious.
No, I'm going to just ask the audience, just hang on. We've actually got to hear what's being said here. So it's all very well to laugh, but we want to hear what's being said.
Steve Goddard, he has shown the NASA figures, and the graph was originally showing that 1930s were warmer than recent decades, and that is correct. And people have recognised that for many, many years. And in the recent years, they've been reversed so that the 1930s were reduced in temperature and the later periods were inflated in temperature. That's a fact. Now, the Bureau of Meteorology is exactly the same. And Greg Hunt squashed an investigation of the Bureau of Meteorology earlier this year.
OK, all right, Greg Hunt.
Can I just check one thing? NASA. Now, NASA.
Yes.
The people that landed men on the moon. I should just ask, actually, you believe we landed men on the moon?
But, see the little trick there?
No.
It's questioning whether or not I believe that I'm a moon skeptic. Now,
are you?
No, I'm not.
Oh, right. No, but I mean, it's a serious accusation. I mean, the idea that NASA and presumably, I should say to people, by the way, that the Australian Academy of Science have done a brilliant... You can never get any sense on programmes like this. They're adversarial and things. But the Science of Climate Change, the Australian Academy of Sciences report is superb. I brought it because I'm going to come and give it to you in a minute so you can have a read. But that's very good if you want to see... But the point is that the accusation that NASA... Pretty all the Australian, the Met Office in the UK, everybody is collaborating to manipulate global temperature data.
Are you accusing me of saying they're collaborating?
What, they've all manipulated it in the same way and accidentally got to the same answer. Is that what you're saying?
NASA was led by James Hanson.
What about the Met Office in the UK then?
Well, this could go around all night.
Well, I know it could, yes.
It could go around all night. I want to hear from Greg. Greg Hunt's been accused of
though.
stopping an investigation into the truth of the things that Malcolm Roberts is saying. So you get a chance to answer here, and please go ahead.
Sure. So look, I think from my perspective, from the government's perspective, what we do is we take the advice of not just our agencies, but the international agencies as well. But in particular, the Bureau of Meteorology, the CSIRO, the Department of the Environment, Department of Industry, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, all have very similar views that you've had an increase in CO2 parts per million from about 280 to 400 parts per million from about 1750. You've had an increase of about 1 degree in global temperatures just over the last century. And what you see as part of that obviously, is the physical impact. The international community, though, comes to very similar conclusions. The World Meteorological Organization, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Oxford, Cambridge, NASA, all of these different organisations, and I don't think that they are either subject to a collective folly, nor do I think that they're subject to some sort of conspiratorial collusion. I respect the right of people to have their different views, but we don't make our policy on that. Our policy is that it's real and it's important and it's significant, and therefore we played a role at the Paris conference. We're achieving our targets, and perhaps the most important thing Australia has done in the last 10 years in this space is we helped broker the Montreal Protocol Agreement last November, which will deliver 90 billion tonnes of emissions reductions between now and 2050. Probably the most important thing that Australia's done in this space.
I'm going to bring in, I was going to bring in Lily first because I want to hear from Mathematician now.
Well, first of all, I cannot believe we're still having this conversation. I feel like we should be moving on and discussing how we're going to create mitigation processes, how we're going to create adaptation processes. I think that as far as I'm concerned, the conversation is over. The second thing I want to say is that there is overwhelming consensus with climate change scientists that this is real. These are scientists who have studied in this particular area for many years in their particular field. I don't know how a lay person can go and look at graphs and come to their own conclusions, because you're potentially leaving yourself open to cherry-picking information, like a particular year was down and coming to false conclusions. This is all taken into account with experts who have studied in this field. You don't ask your architect to read your medical charts, just as you don't ask your accountant to perform surgery on you. These are all experts in their field, and they advise us on what is real and what is not real. And as far as I'm concerned, where politics comes into play is how to implement their advice.
As far as I'm concerned, politics should be based on empirical evidence. All policy should be based on empirical evidence. I've heard consensus, which is not science. I've heard appeals to authority, which is not science. I've heard various illusions.
Hang on.
I've heard. Hang on.
The evidence.
Hang on, Brian. You showed me a graph of temperature.
Yeah, but I can show you.
You showed me a graph of temperature, but no one has ever explained cause and effect. What is important in science?
One of your inspirers is Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman says it doesn't matter how beautiful, how emotional your theory. If the evidence does not suit, it is wrong. That's what Richard Feynman says. And what we need is not just empirical evidence. Can I have 1 minute?
We need empirical. Hang on.
Yeah,
we need empirical evidence that demonstrates and proves cause and effect. Greg Hunt says he relies on advice. I have never ever heard Greg Hunt say that he relies on data.
Let me tell you what I rely on.
Outlined the data.
And I won't try and talk to
advice.
the panel. I'd like to talk to particularly the young people that are sitting in front of us this evening. But what I see is I saw my friends go swimming at Maroubra Beach on last Sunday, and that shouldn't happen in August. I go to islands in the Pacific, and they are sinking. They are our neighbours and probably will end up to be environmental refugees to Australia. Thirdly, and we might get to it, the CSIRO cuts that the government has undertaken is just kind of nuts in relation to what's going on in terms of climate change. There are a number of sceptics that exist within the Australian Parliament, and we've heard some of that tonight. But most importantly, what we're talking about and what we're arguing about is in fact what these young people in front of us are going to be living in a real way. And that to me should be the absolute starting point for the work that should be done by governments and others, including everyone in this audience. We can all have a role in dealing with climate change, but surely the overwhelming thing for young people, and I've got a son and a daughter, is that we are inheriting this and how stressful that must be for a young person.
Now, Brian, you asked for a minute, and you wanted to respond to
a broader
Malcolm
point about how you would do science and this issue in general. So it's obviously a sensible, as you said, a very important question to ask. What will our climate be like? Which is essentially the probability of weather. What's it going to be like in 2050 and 2100 under different scenarios, given that we understand the physical mechanism for greenhouse warming, etc. I mean, you were right in one thing you said, which is that CO2 is essential for life. It is. The temperature on the surface of the Earth would be very low, below freezing, if it wasn't for the fact that we had a greenhouse effect. You see that on Venus as well. So we understand the physical mechanisms. But the point is, it's a legitimate question and a very important question to ask. What if we carry on emitting greenhouse gases at this rate, or an increased rate or a decreased rate, what do we think will be the impact on the climate in 50 years' time?
We can only answer that question if we understand it now.
So, yes. So the way you do that is you make measurements now of temperatures, sea levels, Arctic ice volume, etc., etc., etc. And then you try and model the climate in order to make a prediction about the future. Now, that's the only way that you can make a prediction about the future. There is no other way. So you can check the models.
But Brian, the models have already been proven wrong, hopelessly wrong.
Well, no.
Yes, they have.
You cross-check them into the past, for example, they do quite nicely. They have a large but actually shrinking error range on them. But the question is, if you don't do that, if you don't model, which is a central part of the scientific process, how do you go about answering the question, which, as you said, our young people here have a right to ask, which is, what will the world be like in 2050, in 2075, in 2100? If you don't model it, this is my question to you, if you don't model it, how can you go about trying to answer the question?
The models that the IPCC uses are unvalidated and erroneous and have already been proven hopelessly wrong. And that's a fact.
That wasn't my question.
That wasn't my question.
How would you go about answering the question?
You answer the question by making projections based on models, providing the models are validated and have been proven to be accurate. And the models have already been proven to be inaccurate, and the IPCC has recognised that and admitted it. Now, what we need to do is look at the empirical data, and the empirical data says quite categorically that the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are a result of temperature changes.
No, that's flat out wrong.
No, it's not. That's correct.
It is flat out
I've looked at the data that the
Sorry,
UN
just hang on. He listened to you, and now you have to listen to him.
It is wrong. Let me just. All right, I'll just give you one snapshot. So I took a snapshot of the different bits of evidence for 2015. So global upper ocean heat content, highest on record in 2015. Global sea level, highest on record in 2015. 70 millimetres higher than that observed in 1993. Global surface temperature, highest on record. El Nino, something like a 10 to 40% contribution to that. And tropical cyclones, well above average overall. As you said, even the anecdotal data. I actually had a wonderful. I was going to comment on a story then, but I won't do because it'll take too long. But as you said, so the point is, you go evidence. Arctic continues to warm, sea ice extent low, Arctic land surface temperature in 2015 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit above 1981 to 210 average. But the point is, the key point is that if you don't accept that the only way to try to formulate policy on what we do with emissions is to build models, that's the only way you can predict the future. Otherwise, you have tarot cards.
Just before you come in, Malcolm, I'm going to interrupt because I want to hear from the Science Minister, because in the end, the government has to decide whether to trust the models and to act and make policy on the basis of them. Will you continue to do that?
Sure, of course we will. For the viewers at home, we have an audience here which includes lots of sort of dangerously bright-looking young people. And part of our sacred trust is to make the best policy we can based on our best understanding of the science. Whether it's the anecdotal evidence, whether it is the advice of the agencies, whether it's the data, whether it's the World Meteorological Organisation, it all points in the same direction. Having said that, we then have to get the right policies which will actually reduce emissions, and the only way to do that is to do this, as Brian says, at a global level, which was why the Paris conference was such a shining moment in contemporary human history. You know, a very sort of broken world in many ways, lots of challenges. People came together, countries came together, all the different cultures and religions were present, and there was a commitment for real global action on this topic, and that, I think, was a moment of paramount hope in the world that we live in.
But Minister, with respect, why have you smashed the CSIRO?
That's a ridiculous comment.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you because we have a question. I'm sorry.
No, I will take that on if that's all right.
You can in a minute.
No,
but we actually have a question.
I will now, Tony.
We have a question on the topic, and we'll go to the question first. So we'll go to Anastasia Teese. Thank you, Anastasia.
How is it that the current government sees it sufficient to award only $37 million to CSIRO climate research over the next 10 years, when the government has also just spent $40 million of Australian taxpayers' money on the 2016 Olympics for the swimming team alone?
Look, thanks, Anastasia. The starting point with respect is incorrect. This was an additional $37 million. It's adding 15% to the workforce that would otherwise have been there. We have in the CSIRO, and this was one of my first decisions in the new role, a great organisation, but I made a decision to emphasise the importance of primary climate science. We added 15% to the workforce, so that $37 million is an additional $37 million.
Can I just get the figures here? Because 275 CSIRO scientists were sacked.
That's right.
How many did you re-employ as part of this, bringing them up to extra 15?
Again, your starting point is wrong. What's happening is that CSIRO staff numbers are increasing by well over 200 over the next 3 years.
So how many climate scientists in the initial tranche of job losses lost their jobs?
There was, I think we just have to make a very important point. CSIRO revenue is increasing by 115 million over the next 3 years.
But
CSIRO staff
you saw it necessary to re-employ climate scientists because climate scientists have been sacked and that climate science has been taken off the CSIRO's agenda.
No, it hadn't been taken off. It had been given less emphasis, and I made a decision in consultation with the Prime Minister that on our watch, in our time, it was going to be given priority. And I take full responsibility for that decision. I understand Malcolm might disagree. I respect his views, and I think it is important.
Hang on, Greg. If you respected my views, you'd actually reply to them. I
respect but disagree. And then...
with data, mate.
Then the next thing, though, is we've added $37 million. We've added 15% to the workforce, and we're putting out a new statement of expectations for CSIRO.
So very briefly, can you just give us the numbers? How many were sacked, climate scientists, and how many did you re-employ?
Well, on my watch, we're adding 15% to the workforce.
And not on your watch? How many did you lose?
I'll let others go over the history of that.
Oh, so you're not sure?
No, I'll just... your starting point about the overall numbers was incorrect. Overall numbers are increasing by more than 200. And I think that that's an extremely important thing. Well, great commitment to what I want to be the world's premier scientific research organisation.
All right. Now, to some degree, the Minister was responding to what you just said, Linda Burney, so you can get a right of reply here, but briefly.
Lily is the mathematician with us, and the maths just don't add up to me. There was $115 million taken out of the CSIRO before your watch, and I congratulate you for putting the emphasis back on climate change. 1,300 jobs gone out of the CSIRO, but in the last financial year, 296 jobs gone, 61 climate scientists being put back in, as I understand it. Now that, to me, doesn't add up. One of the things that's just so wonderful, everyone, about the CSIRO, as you know, it is an international organisation with enormous respect. And it just seems to me that the gutting of it prior to Minister Hunt coming on board is something that was well documented. And trying to put it back now is going to be a very difficult exercise to catch up, because we know that many of those scientists that lost their jobs, climate change scientists, have actually sought work overseas and in other places. So how you rebuild it is just crucial, and let's hope it can be done.
All right, brief reply to the Minister.
we're creating a National Climate Science Centre based out of Hobart. It'll work with the Bureau of Meteorology, it will work with the Antarctic Research Centre, it will work with the Cooperative Research Centre on the Antarctic. The chief scientist, Alan Finkel, and I worked on putting this together. It becomes actually a hub and a magnet for some of the world's best scientists. And in fact, we're putting more than $2 billion into Antarctic research with a new icebreaker, which itself will attract scientists from all around the world. So my vision is that the CSIRO, which is growing, not shrinking, growing, not shrinking, will be the world's premier research organisation. And I think we have the people to do it. I have that belief.
Just a very quick final response here from Malcolm Roberts. Now, were you in government, if you had the power to do it, would you just sack all the climate scientists?
I would want to see the empirical data that they have provided. They have not provided empirical data that proves cause and effect of human carbon dioxide. Greg, what I understand is that, from the reports in the newspaper, admittedly, is that the CSIRO needs to beef up its decadal research. Now, if we need to beef up the decadal research 10 to 20 years in advance, because we don't understand it, how can we possibly predict what is happening 100 years in advance?
Malcolm,
this is complete nonsense.
go to Tuvalu and ask the people there.
Linda, the satellites show that our Pacific Islands are growing in size.
OK, I'm going to... Sorry, I have to bring Brian back in again.
There's only one last thing.
The Australian sea levels in the last 20 years have moved up at an average of 0.3 of a millimetre per annum. That equates to about 30 millimetres in a century. That is entirely natural and normal.
OK, all right, a final word to Brian Cox.
The final word is that I would encourage everyone watching it, because it's very difficult in these situations because there are many numbers bandied about and people end up shouting at each other. But I would recommend that you go and look at some of the trusted sources on the web, and NASA is one of them, but you'll find it on the Australian government websites as well. And you find out for yourself, you have a look, there's some beautifully presented reviews of the data and the modelling. And the other thing I agree with you on is that obviously the surest thing to do is to do an experiment. You are right. And we are doing that experiment.
I haven't said
and we
could
continue to do it. So we could continue to say, let us continue to increase the CO2 levels in the atmosphere and see what happens. The problem with that experiment is that as we understand the climate today, you get to a point, and we're not too far off, where it gets very difficult to reverse the effects on century-long timescales, especially because we don't fully understand the way that the Arctic ice and the Antarctic ice and how fast they will melt. There are problems there in the models. And so we don't understand how fast that climate can shift and change. In response to what is, the last thing I'd say, it's a very rapid pulse increase in CO2, and that's the challenge. So you would be right again to say that the climate varies over long timescales. But as far as we know, we've not tested the Earth's climate with such a rapid pulse increase in greenhouse gases. And that's the problem that the scientists are asked to help the politicians form policy around. It's that problem. And that's a final thing I would say. The scientists don't form policy, and rightly so. We live in democracies. Politicians form policy. The scientists are asked a question, which is model this as best you can and give us give us advice as best you can. That's what's happening. So the idea that there's some conspiracy, I don't know why there would be, but the idea that there is one is nonsensical.
Okay.
The question's been asked.
All right, we've got a lot of questions to get through tonight, but if you have any questions about how Q&A, the program that is, works, join the Facebook discussion with Q&A executive producer Peter McAvoy tomorrow, 12 noon Eastern Time. Now, our next question comes from Adam Selinger.
Oh, thank you. So in the beginning, there were experts and there were celebrities. And then the experts became celebrities, Sir David, Brian, and celebrities became experts, often in fields where they had very little experience. There are now elected policy makers suggesting that perhaps we need not listen to experts anyway because their views are no more important than anyone else's. So my question is, who should we listen to in order to make informed decisions, contribute to sensible comment about important matters such as climate change, immigration, census data, and not simply follow the panicked herd? Who do we listen to?
Lily, let's start with you.
We listen to the experts, without a doubt. I mean, I guess Are you asking about something specifically, or?
Well, you gave a range of things: climate change, immigration, census data, and so on.
I think there's no question that we should ask the experts in their field about the things that they know most about.
I wish we knew who the census data experts were. They seem to have all failed.
Yeah, everyone's shrinking. I think where, say, science communication, for example, comes into play is that it's a wonderful tool to be able to broadcast some of the findings. And what that does is ignites passions and curiosities that children and students might have in order for them to explore it for themselves. So I think when it comes to climate change, there's no question that we should ask experts, but certainly I think people in the public eye can do a wonderful job in broadcasting certain areas.
Linda Burney, who would you trust to make the best informed decisions?
I think the most important people to ask are the people that are going to be directly affected by the decisions, no matter what the topic is, if it's immigration, if it's Aboriginal affairs, if it's education, if it's climate change. I mean, obviously, you don't talk to one particular group of people. You need to talk to experts, you need to talk to politicians, you need to talk to the media, but the most important people to speak to always, I have found in my many years of public life, is to talk and get the views of the people that are going to be affected by whatever that decision or that issue is.
Brian Cox, I'll bring you in, and I found a nice quote of yours. Changing your mind in the face of evidence is absolutely central to a civilised democratic society. The question is asking, who should we listen to in order to make those judgments?
It's interesting, actually. You asked two questions. You said who should we listen to, but also who should make the decisions. And there is a distinction there. It is absolutely clear that in a democratic society, the elected politicians make the decisions, and they're advised by a range of experts. But ultimately, we live in democracies, so therefore, ultimately, I suppose it's the people who elect the politicians, so the people make the decisions. That requires, though, an education system that functions extremely well. You need a population for a democracy to work that is aware of how to think, how to select information. We have a vast amount of information available to us at the moment, some from reputable sources, some from unreputable sources. So those skills to allow your population to look at the information that's out there, to be able to come to a reasoned conclusion, or at least to, I mean, you can't do that on every issue, of course, because you have other things to do as a citizen, but to be able to get a sense of where the expertise lies, where the considered views are.
And what if that highly educated population votes for Donald Trump, for example? Well,
I mean, we are seeing this, though. I mean, we've seen it to some extent in Britain, and we've seen it in America as well. Those are reactions. We need to understand what those are reactions to. I mean, I would say that they're different in every country. There's probably commonality there, which is that in Britain, with the Brexit vote and with Trump, you're seeing the fact that globalisation, which is partly good and partly bad, has certainly in Britain has benefited some people hugely and other people not at all, and actually reduced their standard of living. So these are political questions. But ultimately, I think it comes down to the fact that in a democracy, your population, education is probably, along with health and defence, the prime responsibility of a government, because a democracy will not function if you don't have citizens who are able to make the decisions.
But there are so many countries that aren't democracies.
Well, yes. But I like democracy. I want to protect it.
Well, of course you do, but that's not how the whole world is.
Oh, no, absolutely. And there are different models, as you say.
Yes.
China's a different
But
model.
also, Brian, you're assuming that our governance is successful. And I brought along a book here by Richard Court, who was the Premier of Western Australia. It's Rebuilding the Federation. And he documents the destruction of our federation, our constitution in this country.
I don't think people are going to be able to read that on the television. They can freeze the
it's only
frame
40
and blow
pages.
it up.
It's only 40 pages, but...
Malcolm, when you get to the Parliament, you're not allowed to use props.
That's okay, but I will be using facts. Now, what we've got is an education system, particularly at our universities, that are teaching people what to think, not how to think. So who do we listen to? In answer to your question, we listen to the people who provide the empirical evidence that highlights cause and effect. It doesn't matter what situation it is, policy should be built on cause and effect. And we have got to get a proper governance back in this country so that we can get a proper education system and return to the basics.
So you're happy to listen to them provided they're not 97% of scientists, for example?
But the 97% consensus has been debunked and found to be a 0.3% consensus, and that, by the way, includes no one who has ever provided the empirical evidence that human production of carbon dioxide affects our climate.
Okay, all right. Sorry, I don't mean to get back there.
0.03%.
No, I said 0.3.
My mistake.
My mistake. Sorry, climate science agree.
0.3.
0.3.
Greg Hunt, the question was an interesting one.
Yeah, it was. I'll go to the original question if that's right. I think
do.
it was a great question, and just to remind us, it was about who do you listen to and how do you make decisions. It actually goes right to the heart of the whole democratic process and construct. And if it's just the elected representatives, and there are three of us at this table, then that is a very hollow system. It's not quite demagoguery because we're elected, but it's a disconnected system. If it's just the massed voices of those who argue the loudest, that's populism. The democratic process really works when you have what I would call a dialogue, and that's this constant engagement that we can now actually have more easily than at any other time in history other than when we were in very small political units, the sort of Athenian ideal, where people can feed in, you engage, you listen, you test, you make decisions. In the end, whether it's Linda or myself or Malcolm, we all have to make decisions. But this constant dialogue of discovering what people need at community levels, of testing policy models, and then of making decisions and then getting feedback, that is actually a great moment in the evolution of democracy. Imperfect, but a very important moment in history.
Made perfect by public servants.
And the ABC.
Of course. Let's go to the next question. It's from Katie Liang.
Tony, I would like to hear what Linda thinks about this. So Senator Roberts is pushing for the repeal of Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act to advocate for unfettered free speech. However, speech is already quite liberal in Australia. So there is a recent very controversial cartoon by Bill Leake, and despite its unfavourable portrayal of Indigenous fathers, it did open debates about the neglect of vulnerable children, and it also actually spawned a social media movement where Indigenous parents and children posted pictures documenting how their fathers have inspired them. So do you think that the benefits from this open debate outweigh the racist sentiments? And do you think this calls for a case for unfettered speech?
So I didn't mean to interrupt you there, Katie. Linda Burney, let's start with you.
Thanks, Katie. There's a lot of questions in what you've just asked, and I think I might go backwards or start from the last point you made. The cartoon by Bill Leake, you're correct. It did, unleash a wonderful social media campaign. I don't know if everyone saw it, but with this beautiful photographs of Aboriginal dads with their children. But I refuse to give Bill Leake the credit for that. The cartoon that Bill Leake put forward reminded me of the 60s. It reminded me when I was a little girl, there used to be this cartoonist called Jolliffe. I think it used to be in the Post or the Pix or something like that. And the way Aboriginal people were depicted in the 60s and the way Aboriginal people were depicted in the Leake cartoon were stereotypical and ugly. Yes, there is no denying that there is very real social issues when it comes to Aboriginal children in many Aboriginal communities. Everyone knows that. In relation to 18C, I don't think that that has a chance of getting through. The Prime Minister has been very clear in his statements that he will not entertain 18C being put back on the agenda, as has my party through Bill Shorten. What concerns me, and I'm sorry to get political, is that there are certain people within the government that are very much pushing, along with some crossbenchers, that we should be allowing 18C or parts of 18C to be removed to allow hate speech in this country. Now, I was just outraged when I heard the position put forward, I'm not quite sure by which politician, that you're only offended by hate speech, by racist speech, if you allow yourself to be offended. Well, as an Aboriginal person, I can assure you that sort of speech is hurtful and it's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous to say, oh, well, you only can be offended if you're allowed to be offended. This country is an amazing country made up of diversity from every part of the world, and we cannot allow us to go backwards in terms of those sorts of attitudes, and certainly my party will not be entertaining any changes to 18C.
Can I, just very briefly, are you equating Bill Leake's cartoon on that instance with hate speech?
I'm equating I'm saying Bill Leake's cartoon was stereotypical in its presentation. I'm saying that
would you want it censored?
I don't believe there is a need for that sort of depiction and that sort of stereotypical depiction of Aboriginal people in the media. That cartoon really upset me. It made me feel quite ill in its going off the back of those shocking images that we all saw at Dondale and the sort of reaction that got, and then for Bill Leake to put that cartoon up as some way as a response to that, depicting an Aboriginal man holding a beer can and saying he didn't know whether that was his child or not is not acceptable.
Okay, Malcolm Roberts.
The situation in regard to the Bill Leake cartoon, I'm a public servant, however, I'm also a parent. And when I saw that cartoon, my instant response was feeling for parents all around the world and feeling for children in abused relationships. The second thought that came to me, the second feeling, was admiration for Bill Leake having the courage to delve into a topic that's controversial. And the third thing that came to me was exactly what Linda's been working with, the plight of the Indigenous. And we're dancing around it and we're not addressing it. But something else that is really important for me, and that is that this kind of legislation, this kind of curbing of free speech leads to this. This is one of my constituents in Queensland. He says one LGBT activist in New South Wales has lodged at least 28 complaints against me because he disagrees with my views on marriage and morality, including one complaint that I have incited hatred by linking to an Andrew Bolt article on Facebook. I have moved my family after this activist offered to release my address to Islamic organisations. He also conspired with others to lodge complaints in order to seize my house. This abuse occurs because the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board fails to investigate complaints. It is
I'm going to have to get you to go to the last sentence or something, because it could be a very long letter.
The point I'm getting to is that this man is being intimidated in Queensland by a New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board that is working on an activist perpetrating 28 complaints that are basically nonsense.
Okay, Lily, I want to hear you on this question, if I can.
Well, I think I saw the cartoon and I think that it was highly insensitive, and if I was an Aboriginal person, I would have been offended. I think the issue is that it's perpetuating a stereotype, which I think is never useful, whether it be a stereotype of an Aboriginal person or a female in maths or whatever it is. I don't think it adds to the conversation. I know, Katie, you said that your question was it a good thing that it kind of ignited a conversation? I think that there are different kinds of conversations, and there are constructive conversations and destructive conversations, and I don't necessarily think that this was a constructive conversation. But I agree with you in that it did bring about a wonderful social media campaign that it was wonderful to see so many wonderful dads out there. And finally, I think the other problem with this is that it paints every Aboriginal dad with the same brush, and I think that's not fair, because there are good and bad dads in every culture and every race.
Very quickly go back to our questioner, Katie, a brief answer. What was your initial response to the cartoon?
My initial response is that I did find it quite insensitive, and I thought Linda would think so too, so that's why I was trying to ask a question from the opposite perspective, which was Bill Leake's own defence on this cartoon. Okay, I'm going to bring Greg Hunt in now.
Look, did I like it? No. Would I ban it? No. Does it go to an uncomfortable and important issue? Yes. I remember, I think Tony Lateline ran some very confronting stories in about 2005 and 6 about petrol sniffing, child abuse in Mutijulu, Docker River and other areas. And I remember there was criticism of Lateline at the time for stereotyping. I thought they were incredibly important programs, and they helped lead to the phasing in of the Opal fuel, which was virtually impossible to sniff for petrol. And bizarrely, some of those same criticisms from a slightly different perspective were levelled against your program a decade ago. I thought your program served a very positive role, albeit in controversial circumstances. But did I like it? No.
You didn't like the program, or you didn't like the cartoon?
I was confronted by the program.
Right, okay.
I didn't like the cartoon.
I don't really understand, Greg, how you can say, you know, did it go to an important issue? I mean, the issue was the abuse at that detention centre. And I'm not sure what that cartoon added to that discussion. And we're all sort of talking as if there's a denial that there is issues around drug and alcohol abuse in Aboriginal communities. Nobody is saying that. Aboriginal people and people working in those communities do not say that. You referred earlier to the Little Children Are Sacred report. There is the Royal Commission into institutional abuse that's taking place. I want to make it extremely clear right now that there is no denial from the community that there are issues, and I don't understand why Bill Leake would be seen as breaking some great bit of information, because those issues are things that we've been working on for 20 or 30 years.
Let's move on to other subjects. Got a next question. It's from Caitlin Murhey.
Last Friday, our school had our first Year 10 STEM conference, and one of the speakers, Dr. Jennifer McRitchie, spoke about being both a scientist and a musician, and how the two don't have to be mutually exclusive. Her research allows her to study both. Brian Cox, we know you are a legendary scientist, but you were also a musician. So how do you maintain your passion for music as well, and what opportunities have you found to combine both fields?
Well, I think that science and art and music are all responses to the same thing, which is nature, reality, the human condition. How do you respond to the things that you see? And they're all different responses. But I think the commonality is that you notice something that you find interesting and beautiful, and you might want to think about it, you might want to represent it, you might want to study it. So I think that there's a false separation between the arts and the sciences, and actually it can be that might be just in our minds, but it can be more serious, because we can see sometimes that when we come to education policy, for example, we can focus on one at the expense of the other, when in fact all these things are I think they're all necessary responses to nature as we see it.
How do you make time to do both? I think that's implicit in the question.
What I do is we have in Britain, and I hope to do it in Australia, we have a big sort of charity Christmas shows where we invite musicians and scientists and artists and actors, and we just celebrate reason and nature. But what I always do is that I always invite a band at the end, and we never tell anyone who's going to be on. I always invite a band who when I was your age, I was really into band. I should ask you who's your favourite band?
No one in particular.
particular.
No, you don't know anything. But I had my favourite band.
It's you.
And now it was back in the 1980s. Well, it was back in the 1980s, and I always invite a band I want to play with, and I say to them, you can come and I want you to play at our charity show, but I want to play a song with you. And as you said, actually, The Cure we invited 2 years ago because I wanted to play with The Cure. We had New Order last year.
Is it your chance to ask him to come and play at your ski buggy?
Well, I'll be back in November, so maybe we could do that. I'll come and play along and sing about physics.
Aren't these really opportunities for the human mind to explore and to celebrate? Because the wonderful thing about humans is that I believe we are the ultimate resource on this planet. All other resources are made by us, defined by us. And so it's the creativity in humans and the initiative in humans and the love in humans that encourages us to explore and to understand and to really care about others. I believe most humans really care about each other. And music, science are wonderful paths to explore that.
Do you know that 97% of the people in this room agree with what you just said?
Give me your real data. Give me your empirical data.
Well, I think you said it. That is the empirical data. Greg Hunt, you just gave away your environment portfolio to Josh Frydenberg, but he managed to combine it with energy. So is it time now to combine science and arts?
Well, actually, it's funny you say that. As the question was asked, you reminded me of my father. My father was a great rationalist, but he loved nature and art, and when he passed away about 3 years ago, there was a poem that was sent to me. I think it was, "Nature I loved most of all, and next to nature, art. I warmed my hands at the fire of life. It sinks and I am ready to depart." And it was from somebody I didn't know, but who knew my father. And it just defined that yin and yang of art and science and nature together. So,
we've got time for one last...
a strong emotion, thank you.
No, that was a good moment, actually, so we don't often get them. Politician being absolutely genuine. We've got time for one last question. It comes
I think that was a compliment.
Excuse me.
I'm so sorry, it was meant to be a compliment. Sorry, you were very genuine as well. I'm so sorry. I've got one last question. It comes from Madeline Eunice.
In my Year 11 physics class, we were talking about the possible picture of time in which everything is happening at the same time. In other words, it sounds like the answer to the question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? They will both be there and they will always be there. Could you please explain this concept further?
This is for Brian.
You've got about a minute and a half, Brian, to explain the time-space continuum.
Time is one of the great questions in physics, and we have different models of what time is that apply in different circumstances. So Einstein gave us a picture of space-time, which is our best theory of gravity, the framework for cosmology, which is the way we understand the origin and evolution of the universe, and time is essentially a dimension in that theory. It's not like that in our other theories, so-called quantum theories. And then there are the theories of thermodynamics, where you essentially say that there's an arrow of time. So essentially, I had a song called Things Can Only Get Better, which is wrong in absolutely every way. It should never have been made and phrased like that. Things can only get worse because things get more disordered as time goes along. And that's another definition, the so-called thermodynamic arrow of time. So it's one of the great questions. And actually, going back to what you said about the origin of time, whether the universe had an origin at all, whether the Big Bang was an event in some previously existing universe, we're beginning to speculate, and we have empirical evidence that suggests that there was something.
Does it show cause and effect?
I'll be quiet.
That won't stop me, Linda.
It's a very interesting question, as we discussed before the show, actually. When you talk about the origin of the universe, how do you talk? If there was a beginning of time, how do you talk about a cause? And these are central questions in cosmology that I hope your generation will help us solve, because my generation have not yet solved it.
So to go to one of the points in Madeline's question, I saw one of your recent shows and you laid out a series of photographs of different parts of your life, and you seem to suggest that all of those moments in your life could still exist somewhere. Are we talking about a multiverse?
No, it's very briefly, I suppose. We've got 30 seconds now. Einstein's picture of time, space-time, is that you can picture it like this table. And events in our lives just have our places in space-time. They have coordinates, a position in time, a position in space. And you picture your life as what we call a world line through that sheet. But that does imply, because in relativity, there's no definition of what now means. It's different for different observers. So it does imply that it's called a block universe, that the past is there and the future is there. And in just the same way that I came from Canberra this morning, Canberra didn't cease to exist when I left it. It's still there, I presume.
It's not a patch on what it was when you were there.
And so Einstein's picture of the universe is like that. Now that suggests that maybe the future is there, and you go into it, and does that mean you don't have free will and all that? So people think about that, but that our model of space-time and gravity, according to Einstein, is that. It's probably not complete. It's one of the great... Actually, the last thing I would say is that Richard Feynman defines science as a satisfactory philosophy of ignorance, which means that you presume that you don't know, and you test, and you try, and you're always, you understand your own fallibility. And so our models of time are probably just that. They're just models, and whether they're absolute and correspond to what time really is, we don't know.
All right, there is one thing I can say for sure, and it's that even though this program will go on forever and ever in the multiverse, in this particular corner of the universe, we really are out of time. Please thank our panel, Linda Burney, Brian Cox, Lily Serna, Greg Hunt and Malcolm Roberts.
Well done.
Thank you. Now, next week, Q&A will be in Melbourne with the Minister for Communications, Mitch Fifield, the Shadow Minister for Health, Catherine King, the British editor of Spiked Online, Brendan O'Neill, comedian, writer, actor and law graduate, Corinne Grant. Till then, good night.